Daniel Reyes had always believed that when he retired from homicide investigations, life would slow down. After 2 decades chasing murderers, negotiating tense standoffs, and comforting grieving families, he had imagined retirement as the long-awaited reward. A quiet home in a peaceful suburb, lazy Sunday mornings with his wife Maya, and afternoons spent restoring his prized 1967 Ford Mustang. Oak Crest seemed like the perfect place for that dream to unfold. Wide streets, manicured lawns, and a homeowners association that promised safety and community order. But what Daniel and Maya didn't anticipate was that their peaceful little corner of America hid something far uglier beneath its picturesque surface. In the beginning, it was subtle. The notices from the HOA came with a smile, signed by Karen Whitfield, the HOA president, with her trademark closing line. "We value every resident's commitment to community harmony." The first complaint was about Daniel's mailbox. It was apparently half an inch too tall according to the newly updated standards. Daniel shrugged it off and fixed it. Then came the issue with the color of Maya's garden chairs, followed by a fine, because the Mustang was parked in the driveway during daylight hours while Daniel was waxing it. The frequency of these notices seemed to escalate week by week, but Daniel and Maya chalked it up to the usual suburban nosiness. It was only after Maya overheard Bryce Whitfield, Karen's 20-something son, loudly mocking them during a neighborhood event that they started seeing things more clearly. Bryce was every inch his mother's son, entitled, smug, and openly disdainful of anyone who didn't fit the mold of Oak Crest's ideal resident. He made no effort to hide his contempt for Daniel, calling him the ex-cop with ghetto habits, and cracking jokes about Maya's Mexican heritage. The neighbors who heard it either looked away or laughed uncomfortably, unwilling to get involved. Daniel wanted to ignore it. After all, he had dealt with far worse on the streets. But Maya, fierce and proud, refused to let it slide. She had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to be made to feel like a second-class citizen in her own home. They decided to hold their ground, determined not to let petty people chase them out of the peace they had earned. But then the harassment escalated from verbal jabs and annoying citations to outright malice. One evening, Daniel came home to find deep scratches along the side of his Mustang, the leather seats slashed open, and an ugly racial slur keyed into the trunk. The security footage was mysteriously deleted from the community cameras managed by the HOA. When Daniel brought the incident to Karen's attention, her response was as chilling as it was dismissive. She claimed the footage had been accidentally overwritten and suggested Daniel try parking the car in the garage next time if he wanted to avoid such incidents. There was no apology, no sympathy, only veiled satisfaction. Daniel's years in law enforcement told him this wasn't random vandalism. It was targeted, calculated, and protected. When he began investigating the HOA records, he discovered Karen had authorized a recent contract with a security company called Oak Crest Secure Solutions, whose listed address was nothing more than a rundown office space 30 miles away. The registered owner was none other than Karen's sister, running a shell company that billed the HOA thousands of dollars each month for neighborhood patrols that didn't actually exist. A quick online search revealed that Bryce and a few of his equally idle friends were being paid as part of this security team. In reality, they spent their nights drinking in backyards and vandalizing the properties of residents Karen wanted to intimidate, Daniel included. Still, Daniel kept his cool. He knew better than to confront such corruption without rock-solid evidence. Maya, however, was livid. She wanted to march straight into the next HOA meeting and call Karen out in front of everyone. But Daniel urged patience. He explained how easy it was for people like Karen to twist narratives, to paint them as troublemakers, to use the very system they control to further punish anyone who stood up to them. No, they needed to be smarter, quieter, and absolutely certain before making their move. Reluctantly, Maya agreed, and together they set about gathering evidence. Daniel installed hidden cameras around the property, ensuring they had their own independent footage. They started collecting every HOA notice, every fine, every interaction. Daniel also began discreetly speaking with other residents, especially minority families, who had complained about Karen's treatment in the past. Slowly, a pattern emerged, a clear, undeniable picture of a corrupt HOA leadership targeting certain homeowners with harassment, fines, and property damage to either force them out or keep them submissive. In this quiet rebellion, Daniel found an unlikely ally in Louis, an older neighbor who had lived in Oak Crest for over 3 decades. Louis was known for his harmless, quirky personality. He liked to tinker with lawn ornaments, bake cookies for new residents, and regale anyone willing to listen with stories about the early days of the neighborhood. Louis also had an extensive network of contacts within Oak Crest and seemed to know everyone's business. He offered Daniel insights into the inner workings of the HOA, revealing which board members were close to Karen, which neighbors had been targeted before, and where he believed the financial misappropriation was occurring. Daniel was cautious. Years of detective work had taught him not to trust too easily, but Louis' information was good, too good to dismiss. With Louis' guidance, Daniel and Maya built a network of residents willing to share their stories, their own HOA notices, and in some cases, their own security footage of Bryce and his so-called security patrol engaging in petty theft, vandalism, and harassment. The momentum was building. What started as Daniel and Maya's personal battle was quickly turning into a collective uprising. Everything came to a head on a hot summer afternoon when Daniel was working on the Mustang, replacing a damaged side mirror Bryce had broken a week prior. He noticed Bryce and his friends lurking nearby, their expressions smug and taunting. When Daniel went inside to grab a tool, Bryce saw his opportunity. In broad daylight, with neighbors watching, Bryce jumped into the Mustang and attempted to hotwire it, fully believing that the worst that could happen was Daniel yelling at him from the porch. But Daniel returned to the scene with something else in hand, his phone, already dialing the non-emergency police line. Before Daniel could even make the call, Karen came running down the street, shrieking and pointing at Daniel, claiming he was a car thief trying to steal her son's new project car. Within minutes, squad cars swarmed the street, and Daniel, who was technically off duty but still the police chief, was ordered to step away from his own car. The absurdity of the moment would have been laughable if it wasn't so dangerous. Daniel's badge and ID quickly settled the immediate confusion, but not before half the neighborhood had witnessed the scene Karen had orchestrated. Maya, furious beyond words, filmed the entire incident from their porch, capturing Karen's false accusations, Bryce's arrogance, and the officer's initial aggressive response. Later, reviewing the footage, Daniel realized it would be a key piece of evidence, not just of attempted theft, but of how Karen weaponized law enforcement and public perception to criminalize an innocent man based solely on prejudice and personal vendetta. That evening, as Daniel sat with Maya watching the footage replay, he knew the time for quiet documentation was over. They had enough evidence, enough allies, and more than enough cause to bring everything into the light. The next HOA meeting was only a few weeks away, and Daniel and Maya prepared to make it a reckoning the likes of which Oak Crest had never seen. This was no longer just about a vandalized Mustang or fake fines. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming dignity in a neighborhood that had lost its way. And Daniel Reyes, once a weary detective looking for peace, rediscovered his purpose, not on the violent streets of his former precinct, but in the quiet battlefields of suburban America, where the enemies wore smiles, held clipboards, and hid behind the pretense of community standards. The fight wasn't over, but the tide had begun to turn. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt something more than anger. He felt hope. The storm was gathering, and this time, the righteous side would be the one that prevailed. As the date of the HOA meeting approached, a nervous energy began to stir among the residents of Oak Crest. For years, they had tiptoed around Karen Whitfield and her clique of board members, fearful of fines, retaliations, or worse. But now, with Daniel and Maya quietly leading the charge, a shift was happening. People were talking in hushed tones at mailboxes, sharing knowing glances at neighborhood gatherings, and exchanging stories they had kept bottled up for far too long. It was as if a collective realization dawned that their individual miseries were part of a much larger scheme of manipulation and abuse. Daniel, methodical as ever, spent his evenings organizing every piece of evidence they had gathered. There were folders labeled meticulously: fraudulent fines, security footage, financial transactions, witness statements, and the crown jewel, video of the incident where Karen had falsely accused Daniel of stealing his own car. Maya worked alongside him, her natural sense of justice fueling her determination to see it through to the end. She drafted the speech Daniel would deliver, balancing righteous indignation with the calm authority of someone who knew they were firmly in the right. Meanwhile, Louis continued his seemingly supportive role, funneling more neighbors towards Daniel and Maya. He presented himself as the seasoned veteran of the neighborhood, someone who had always wanted to fix things, but hadn't had the means or the allies to do it, until now. He provided Daniel with a breakdown of HOA expenditures going back years, noting bizarre patterns, inflated landscaping contracts, suspicious maintenance charges, and the bloated payments to the shell company running the non-existent security service. Yet, something about Louis' eagerness gnawed at Daniel. Years of working homicides had taught him to trust his instincts, and his instincts whispered that Louis' hands weren't entirely clean. Still, Daniel knew better than to blow the case wide open prematurely. Patience had served him well, and it would again. The morning of the HOA annual meeting arrived with sweltering heat, but it wasn't just the summer sun that made the air thick. Residents filled the community center in numbers that surprised even Daniel. People who had avoided HOA meetings for years now came early, filling every seat, with many standing along the walls. Karen, perched at the head of the table in her signature bright blazer, tried to maintain her composure, but her rigid posture and clipped responses betrayed a growing unease. Daniel waited until the financial report portion of the meeting before standing. With calm deliberation, he presented himself, not as the police chief, but as a homeowner, a neighbor, and someone who had endured the worst the HOA could throw at him. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The weight of the truth carried its own authority. He outlined the pattern of harassment, the destruction of his property, the attempted theft of his car, and the false police report. He showed footage of Bryce and his friends vandalizing homes while supposedly patrolling the neighborhood. He laid out the financial fraud with receipts, highlighting payments funneled through Karen's sister's company, and he emphasized how these funds were used not to protect but to intimidate and suppress certain residents. A hush fell over the room. Faces turned pale, jaws tightened, and even those who had once sided with Karen shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Karen attempted to interrupt, her voice shrill and defensive, but Daniel calmly requested his time to speak be respected. He ended his presentation with a call to action, not just to vote out the current leadership, but to investigate where every dollar had gone, to reform the HOA bylaws to prevent future abuse, and to restore Oak Crest into a true community, free from fear and favoritism. And then, just when the room was reaching its boiling point, Daniel turned his attention to Louis. The room went still. He revealed how the years of financial mismanagement didn't start with Karen, but had deeper roots. Daniel detailed how Louis, despite his friendly demeanor, had orchestrated much of the underlying corruption. Louis had manipulated Karen, fanned her prejudices, and used her position to advance his own schemes, quietly siphoning off HOA funds for decades in small increments before expanding into more blatant fraud once Karen assumed power. The shock in the room was palpable. Louis' face flushed crimson as he began stammering denials, but Daniel had anticipated every excuse. He produced signed invoices, cross-checked payments, and even secretly recorded conversations Louis had carelessly engaged in, bragging about how easy it was to run circles around people like Karen. The revelation landed like a thunderclap. The neighbor who everyone thought of as a harmless old man had been the puppet master all along. Before the meeting could descend into chaos, off-duty officers, whom Daniel had coordinated with beforehand, stepped forward. They weren't there as muscle but as observers, ready to step in if Louis or anyone else tried to disrupt the proceedings or escape. Louis, seeing the walls close in, made a last-ditch effort to slip out quietly, but he was intercepted before he even reached the exit. His stunned expression said everything. The years of manipulation, theft, and quiet control had finally come to an end. In the aftermath of the meeting, the atmosphere in Oak Crest changed overnight. Karen resigned from the HOA board in disgrace, her son Bryce facing multiple charges related to vandalism, theft, and fraud. Louis was led away in handcuffs, facing a mountain of charges that promised to ensure his days of quiet manipulation were well and truly over. The remaining board members, many of whom had either been too intimidated or too indifferent to act before, stepped down voluntarily, leaving space for new leadership to take the reins. Daniel was offered a seat on the newly formed oversight committee, but he declined. He didn't need a title to make a difference, and besides, he had no desire to sit through HOA meetings after everything he had endured. He had done his part, and now it was time for others to step up. Maya, however, accepted a nomination to serve on the board, bringing a fresh perspective and a steely commitment to transparency and fairness. The reforms came quickly. Mandatory financial audits were implemented, new protections were put in place for all residents, especially minority families, and the bylaws were rewritten to prevent the concentration of power in the hands of a few. Oak Crest began to reflect the diversity and vibrancy of its residents rather than the narrow prejudices of its former rulers. For Daniel and Maya, the victory wasn't just about personal vindication. It was about reclaiming a community that had been hijacked by greed and hatred. It was about proving that dignity could prevail even in the quietest suburbs, that justice could be served without resorting to rage, and that the principles Daniel had lived by throughout his career still had a place beyond the city streets. Daniel still worked on his Mustang, but now neighbors stopped by to admire it rather than vandalize it. Children waved when Maya walked her dog down the street, and families who had once considered moving out now felt a renewed sense of belonging. The neighborhood no longer felt like a place where people were constantly watching each other, looking for reasons to file complaints. It felt like home. As summer turned to autumn, Daniel sat on his porch one evening, reflecting on the months of turmoil. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that they had done it the right way. They hadn't allowed themselves to be consumed by anger, hadn't lowered themselves to the petty games of Karen and Louis. They had held their heads high, stood firm, and fought back with truth and integrity. He thought about all the times he had stood in courtrooms, testifying against criminals, watching justice unfold slowly but surely. Oak Crest had become its own kind of courtroom, and the verdict had been clear. The bad actors had been unmasked, the victims had been heard, and the community had been restored. Daniel knew there would always be challenges, that no neighborhood was ever perfect. But the lesson was clear: when good people refused to back down, refused to be silent, corruption couldn't thrive forever. With vigilance and unity, even the deepest rock could be cut out, and something healthier could grow in its place. As the porch light flickered on, and Maya called him in for dinner, Daniel stood and stretched. The fight had been exhausting, but it had been worth it. Justice had come to Oak Crest, not through force, but through perseverance. And that made all the difference. In the months that followed, Oak Crest seemed to breathe again. The heavy atmosphere of fear and quiet submission lifted like fog after a storm. Daniel and Maya Reyes, once the primary targets of a corrupt system, now found themselves as quiet figures of respect in the community, not because they sought recognition, but because they had stood their ground when it mattered most. Maya's role on the new HOA board was welcomed by most, a signal that the days of secretive decisions and personal vendettas were over. One of the first changes to sweep through Oak Crest was the institution of regular, transparent community meetings. No longer were decisions made behind closed doors by a select few. Every significant decision, every expenditure, and every policy change was open for discussion, documented, and voted upon fairly. The minutes were shared openly, and every resident, whether they had lived in Oak Crest for decades or had just moved in, had a voice that was respected. It wasn't perfect, democracy seldom was, but it was honest, and for the first time in years, people felt like they belonged. Daniel took satisfaction in watching Maya thrive in her new role, but he also cherished the return of simple pleasures. He reclaimed his afternoons for projects he had long neglected. His classic Mustang, the vehicle that had symbolized so much more than a car during the darkest days of their conflict, gleamed brighter than ever. With every hour spent under its hood, Daniel felt like he was not just restoring a machine, but reclaiming fragments of his peace and identity that had been nearly lost to bitterness. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel decided to take the car out for a drive. As he rolled through the neighborhood, heads turned, but this time, the looks weren't filled with resentment or hostility. Children waved, adults nodded respectfully, and a few even gave him a thumbs up as he passed. It wasn't about the car, he realized. It was about what it represented, a neighborhood where people could enjoy their lives without fear of petty retribution. The block parties became a staple of Oak Crest life, organized not by a controlling HOA, but by volunteers who genuinely wanted to build a sense of belonging. Daniel and Maya often attended these events, seeing faces old and new, learning stories they had never heard before. They discovered how many neighbors had endured similar harassment under the old regime, but had felt too isolated to speak out. Some had been threatened with fines so frequently they considered moving. Others had faced subtle racism, the kind that wasn't screamed but whispered through regulations and selective enforcement. At one of these gatherings, Daniel met the Rodriguez family, who lived just 2 streets down. Mr. Rodriguez, a soft-spoken veteran like Daniel, shared how his flag had been forcibly taken down by Karen's enforcers. It hadn't been as public as Daniel's ordeal, but it had left deep scars. Listening to him, Daniel felt both anger and affirmation, anger at how much had been hidden, but affirmation that their stand had illuminated these injustices. Maya, on the other hand, became a quiet force for good on the HOA board. She listened more than she spoke, built alliances rather than dominance, and ensured that policies were not just legal, but humane. She worked to eliminate the predatory fine structures, replacing them with fair guidelines that focused on community upkeep without punishing individuality. Under her leadership, the HOA stopped being a tool for control and started becoming a resource for the people. One evening, after a particularly productive meeting, Maya returned home visibly emotional. Daniel, sensing something was different, asked what had happened. She explained that during the meeting, a young mother had stood up and shared her gratitude. Under the previous board, she and her biracial family had been fined relentlessly for harmless things like chalk drawings on the sidewalk or mismatched patio chairs. Since the reforms, her family finally felt free to live, and her children could play outside without fear of being watched or judged. Daniel felt a surge of quiet pride, not the kind that shouted from rooftops, but the kind that settled in his chest like a warm weight. They hadn't just changed the rules, they had changed lives. Meanwhile, the fallout from the exposure of corruption continued beyond Oak Crest. News of the scandal spread to nearby neighborhoods, igniting their own movements against similar abuses. Local journalists covered the story, framing it not just as a local dispute, but as an example of how unchecked power within small institutions like HOAs could destroy communities from within. Daniel was asked to give interviews, to offer his perspective on leadership, justice, and community rebuilding. He agreed, not because he enjoyed the spotlight, but because he wanted others to understand that standing up to corruption was possible and necessary. With every interview, every article, Oak Crest became a symbol of transformation. But Daniel remained grounded. He knew the work was ongoing, that no victory was ever final. There would always be challenges, always be individuals tempted by power, always moments when people forgot the lessons of the past. But he also knew something equally important. Once a community woke up, it was difficult to lull it back into submission. Daniel and Maya established a neighborhood watch program, not the aggressive, intimidating kind that had existed under Louis' influence, but one based on community cooperation. Volunteers patrolled not to police their neighbors, but to ensure safety, to assist the elderly, to foster a sense of security through kindness rather than fear. The program was an immediate success, especially among families with young children and senior citizens who had previously felt isolated. In the broader county, Daniel's experience in Oak Crest also changed how he approached his role as police chief. He introduced training sessions that emphasized the importance of cultural sensitivity, the dangers of institutional bias, and the need for community-focused policing. His officers respected him for it, understanding that these weren't empty policies, but lessons Daniel had lived through personally. Some of the officers told him how their own families lived in HOA communities plagued by similar problems, and how seeing Oak Crest's transformation gave them hope for their neighborhoods. Daniel realized the ripple effects of his and Maya's actions extended further than they had imagined. Back at Oak Crest, the cultural shift became more visible with every passing season. Residents planted gardens, painted their homes in colors that reflected their personalities, decorated for holidays without fear of fines, and organized cultural celebrations that brought people together. What had once been a neighborhood of forced conformity blossomed into a vibrant mosaic of diversity. Years later, Daniel stood on his porch, older, but with the same quiet strength he had always carried. His Mustang was now a beloved fixture at community car shows, and Maya had gone on to become the longest-serving HOA board member in Oak Crest history, respected for her fairness and wisdom. New families moved in, unaware of the neighborhood's tumultuous past, but benefiting from the rights and freedoms secured by those who came before them. Daniel occasionally recounted their story to new neighbors, not to boast, but to remind them of what could happen when good people stayed silent. He wanted the lessons to remain alive, that vigilance was the price of freedom, that justice was everyone's responsibility, and that community meant more than shared fences. It meant shared respect, shared safety, and shared dignity. He often thought about how close they had come to walking away, how easily they could have sold their house and left the nightmare behind. But then he looked around. The kids playing ball down the street, the neighbors chatting over evening walks, the sound of laughter replacing the old hush of fear, and he knew they had made the right choice. Maya would occasionally join him on the porch after her meetings, both of them content in their shared quiet. They didn't need to speak much in those moments. Their story, their journey, lived in the walls of their home, in the streets of their neighborhood, in the freedom of their community. And though Oak Crest wasn't perfect, though no place ever truly was, it was home. Not just a house within a subdivision, but a living testament to the power of resilience, the necessity of integrity, and the enduring value of justice tempered by grace. Daniel took a deep breath, the evening breeze warm against his skin, and whispered to himself with a satisfied smile, "This is how it should have always been." And with that, he closed his eyes, feeling the comfort of peace hard-earned and forever cherished.